Today, I'm going to be addressing the role of Korea's division and unfinished national liberation struggle in US-China conflict. So if Dr. Hammond opened us up very generally, I'm going to zoom in and get quite specific here, so bear with me for a little. The last time the United States and China fought a war against one another was during the Korean War. Korea's division and China's division really formed two fronts in an ongoing war in East Asia between the forces of US imperialism and neocolonialism on one hand, and the forces of national liberation and socialism on the other. The Korean War was a key moment of confrontation between these forces, and a ceasefire for the Korean War was signed in 1953, but the war has never technically ended. And so Korea still plays an important role and is an important site of US-China conflict and contradictions. As a divided country, Korea plays a dual role in world politics. It's both a strategic pillar for US imperialism and a strategic pillar of anti-imperialist resistance. The original circumstances of division are still relevant to this duality. Koreans did not choose division, it was imposed on us by the United States. After Japan's defeat in World War II, the masses of Korean people were liberated from decades of colonialism and immediately began to organize our own self-governing people's committees and an independent provisional government. This provisional government was crushed when the US military arrived, and a schism occurred in Korean history. In the North, a socialist state was constructed based on the authority of the people's committees and the masses of workers, peasants, and intellectuals. In the South, the same landlords, capitalists, and police who had collaborated with Japan switched their allegiance to the United States. The people's committees were destroyed. The left was effectively exterminated through years of mass killings that claimed hundreds of thousands of lives, even before the start of the Korean War. And an anti-communist police state was created to serve a tiny class of capitalists dependent on the US and Japan. Although South Korea has since officially transitioned into a democratic republic, that has not brought about a change to the class in power. And so it remains a neo-colonial state beholden to US monopoly capital and the US military. Since first coming to occupy Korea in 1945, the US military has never fully withdrawn. Today, around 30,000 US troops remain in South Korea, and US war planners even consider South Korea as their so-called forward line of defense. The largest US military base outside of North America is in South Korea, along with two major airfields along its west coast facing China, just coincidentally. The United States' justification for this presence always has to do with containing North Korea, but because of China's proximity, all of these assets ultimately figure into the encirclement of China as well, not to mention Russia. Just yesterday, a US nuclear aircraft carrier, the USS Ronald Reagan, docked in the port of Busan for an unannounced joint drill with the South Korean Navy. This is less than a month after the United States and South Korea also held their largest joint war drills since 2017. The primary reason for both of these sets of military exercises were officially to deter North Korea, but realistically, they are just as threatening to China and to Russia as well. Yet the most valuable asset in South Korea to the US military is South Korea's own armed forces, which officially remain under the command of the United States in wartime. What this effectively means is that the US has a massive reserve army of non-citizen, semi-colonial soldiers in Korea. To be exact, 600,000 active duty troops, along with millions of reservists. Out of the United States, Japan, and South Korea, only South Korea has mandatory military service. Japan, at least officially, does not even have its own military. And so out of these three countries, the greatest burden of defense actually falls on South Korea, which even has to foot the bill for the US's military logistics and environmental cleanup. There is a very strong resemblance here to Korea's role under Japanese colonialism. Hundreds of thousands of Korean people were conscripted during that time as forced laborers, soldiers, and comfort women to feed the war machine of Japan. Today, Koreans continue to be cannon fodder for US and Japanese interests, with the least say in when wars start and against who, despite being the ones who will be first to die and in the greatest numbers, at least out of this so-called alliance. Currently, the United States can only command South Korean soldiers within the Korean peninsula, but South Korean troops have been mobilized to fight in other US wars, from Vietnam to Afghanistan. So there's very little reason to believe that this would not be the case in a US war with China. These are just some of the ways that South Korea remains in a neo-colonial position vis-a-vis Japan and the US. Korea's national liberation struggle didn't end in 1945. It only entered a new phase as yet to conclude. It's only because of national oppression imposed upon the whole of Korea by imperialism that South Korea can be the strategic pillar in US encirclement of China that it is. But this comes at a cost. And that brings us to Korean resistance. I'd like to start by talking about the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, or North Korea, which is playing an increasingly important role in providing a military deterrence against the US. North Korea's nuclear weapons program has always been defensive in nature. There was a time when North Korea tried to bargain its nuclear weapons for a security guarantee from the US. For decades, North Korea also had a no first strike policy for its nukes. That era is now over. 2 weeks ago on September 9th, North Korea passed a new law allowing the use of a preemptive nuclear strike if the country and its leadership are ever about to be attacked. This same law also prevents North Korea from bargaining or surrendering its nuclear program. This is a very important change. For the last 30 years, the US has been obsessed with getting rid of the DPRK's nuclear weapons program. And for 30 years, North Korea was open to the discussion so long as the US was willing to offer something concrete in return: a peace treaty, a permanent end to joint military exercises with South Korea, an end to sanctions. But the US refused, and in fact, they did the opposite. They escalated the sanctions. They escalated the military exercises over time. Now, North Korea has had enough. They're taking denuclearization off the table to signal that from now on, if the US wants to talk, it will have to offer something concrete. And to show they're serious, they're embracing the ability to use a preemptive strike. I think there are three very important causes for this shift. Firstly, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol has spent the last several months championing the so-called kill chain doctrine, which is a military plan that allows South Korea to launch a preemptive strike on North Korea. So you can say this is a bit of a tit for tat situation, but there are also other factors. The second very important factor is Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan and all of the escalation the US has been doing around Taiwan, including Biden's statements around being willing to go to war. The DPRK sees a US-China war coming, so they are drawing a line in the sand and they're telling the US not to cross it. Lastly, I think the unintended consequences of US sanctions on Russia are having an influence on this as well. These sanctions have accelerated the use of non-dollar currencies in international trade, and that provides an opening for the DPRK to be able to circumvent US sanctions over time, which could provide a firmer foundation for it to resist US imperialism. The other significant factor for Korean resistance that I want to cover today is the South Korean masses themselves. South Koreans have toppled 3 governments in the last 60 years. Because of the anti-communist extermination before and during the Korean War, as well as the political climate afterward, the left in South Korea has had an uphill battle in reconsolidating itself. Socialists have never regained the strength that they had in 1945, but South Korea today has a rich history of social movements against the crimes of its dictators, against US military violence, land grabs, and environmental destruction, as well as a very organized trade union movement. On August 13th, thousands of South Korean workers staged rallies and protests across multiple cities against the recent joint US ROK war drills. This was largely ignored in the Western media, but even a lot of other media that did cover the protests actually missed what made them so important. It wasn't about the number of people that came out. The protests brought together South Korea's 2 largest union umbrella organizations, which are traditionally rivals and don't always see eye to eye. These 2 union organizations also released a joint statement with their fellow trade unions in the DPRK. This is a watershed moment and very, very important. It's an incredibly brave move in defiance of the US occupation, in defiance of Korea's division, and in defiance of the reactionary government of Yoon Suk-yeol. The truth is that the neocolonial arrangement in South Korea has always rested on shaky foundations, and that's why the South Korean state has always fought so brutally. You can't deprive a people of independence without force. And by that same token, a people can't take back their independence without organizing a greater force than the one repressing them. What we're seeing now is a willingness from Korean workers to fight for reunification and peace, despite the very real risk of state oppression. The South Korean state is totally captured by imperialist interests, but we shouldn't mistake the action of South Korea's government for the will of its people. Yoon Suk-yeol has been in office for less than 6 months, and his approval ratings are in the gutter. The discontent is widespread. It has a lot to do with his own gaffes and own mistakes, his pretty repugnant personality, but it also has a lot to do with the deteriorating quality of life for all strata of Korean workers since the 1997 IMF financial crisis, and only accelerated since the COVID pandemic. Now we are seeing some of that discontent directed against the president, against Korean multinationals, and against the US military. There are still significant obstacles in the development of a revolutionary movement in South Korea at this time, but if that movement is going to come from anywhere, it's going to be from conscious and organized workers. One other factor that I would highlight is that even the Korean bourgeoisie are proving less compliant than the US would like them to be. China is very, very important to South Korea's economy now. And so South Korea has to tread carefully and try to balance its relationships between China and the United States. The US wants South Korea to become one of its anti-China Avengers. They want them to join the Quad. They want them in on Chips 4. But the reality is that that's not totally in South Korea's interests. I don't want to overstate this angle because the largest Korean multinationals and banks are generally at least 40% owned by US and Japanese firms. But there is a possibility that the US could push this, even the South Korean bourgeoisie, too far, which could help spur more of a rift with the United States. Ultimately, however, it will be the strength of the workers' movement as an anti-imperialist movement that will be the decisive factor. So where South Korea goes from here is going to be driven by the development of these contradictions, the clashing interests between South Korea's workers, its national bourgeoisie, who may now have more to gain from Asian integration than from dependence on the US, its comprador bourgeoisie, who are firmly aligned with US monopoly capital, and of course the imperialists themselves, who just want South Korea to be totally obedient. In the end, Korea's internal contradictions are going to shape the terrain upon which US-China conflict plays out. So to wrap up, I want to share a note on this framework on US encirclement of China. There really is no US military buildup in the Pacific, no encirclement of China without the national oppression of China's neighbors by imperialism. This is just as true for Korea as it is for Hawaii, Wuhan, Okinawa, and anywhere else where you can find US bases, colonies, or satellites. The national liberation struggles of all the peoples of the Pacific and East and Southeast Asia therefore share a unity of interest with China against US imperialism. Some people in these regions do remain suspicious of China's motivations, but I would point out that China's neighbors cannot avoid having relations with China. In most cases, that relationship has existed for thousands of years, and we're not going to move to the moon anytime soon. We can only seek a strong sovereign basis from which we can independently navigate that relationship to our mutual benefit. And in order to do that, US imperialism must go first. And that's why we have to view our seemingly disparate and separate national liberation struggles as component of a larger anti-imperialist struggle that includes China's fight against encirclement and dismemberment. We're living in a time of tremendous threats to humanity, from climate change to COVID to nuclear war. And the only way we can overcome this is through solidarity and cooperation against the very imperialist system which produces these crises by its nature. I hope that we can continue to build this kind of internationalism through these engagements like Friends of Socialist China is hosting. And I want to thank you again.